Unemployment in South Africa continues to generate conversation. A major issue revolves around the increase in the unemployment category and the category of those no longer seeking employment. Africa's most industrialized country lost 86,000 jobs as the number of employed persons decreased from 9,652,000 in the first quarter of 2021 to 9,566,000 in the second quarter of 2021 as well. Now, data released by Stats South Africa shows the drop in employment was largely due to decreases in the manufacturing sector, community services sector, construction, electricity, and business services sectors. There were increases in the mining and transport sectors, while the trade industry reported no change over the same period. Today, we're looking at South Africa's Q2 job report. I'm Tolulokwe Adelaru Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Joining me is Christie Viljoen. He's an economist with PwC South Africa, and he's joining us right now from in-country. Now, Christie, the statistics released by Stats SA paint a very grim picture for the country's joblessness with the release of the latest figures. Now, I found unemployment has hit 34.4% in the second quarter from 32.6%. The number of unemployed people is now 7.82 million. That's a large percentage, maybe not a majority, of course, but a very large number for South Africa. And the Stats SA organization says this is the highest since the quarterly Labor First survey began in 2008. Let's look first at what factors are responsible for driving the unemployment figure up between these between the two quarters that are now being compared.
Yes, I mean, these numbers are quite bad. It basically shows you that 1 in 3 South Africans that should and could be working are actually unemployed. And it's a big concern. We have to be honest that before COVID-19, we already had a big unemployment problem. The unemployment rate was about 28% before COVID-19 arrived. So this has obviously been made worse. So there's a lot of structural issues. We've had unemployment very high for a very long time. And one of the challenges we have is education, the amount of skills that people have when they finish high school, whether it can actually get them a good job, whether it's the kind of employability that attracts foreign investors, and that's one of our biggest challenges. So skills are a big problem, but also it's a case of business confidence. You want businesses to create jobs, and we've seen for many years business confidence, as it's measured officially every quarter, it has been in negative territory, and there's many reasons behind that, many policy uncertainties. So it's a combination of factors. It's not just COVID-19. It's not just the economic recession that we see last year. It's a long-standing structural situation in South Africa.
And we'll hopefully get to looking at the solutions for this long-standing issue. So another part of the report that really does require interrogation is the increase in the number of those who are no longer looking for jobs as well. Now, the expanded unemployment rate also includes those who are discouraged, and that sits at 44.4% from 43.2% in the first quarter. What's discouraging South Africans from looking for employment now?
Yes, so we basically have two unemployment rates. The first one you mentioned, the 34%, is what the official number. And then we've got this expanded definition, which is now at 44%. And that extra 10 percentage points, that's basically people that are able to work, they want to work, but they've given up finding a job. They've given up looking for a job. And I guess it gives you a sense of how bad things really are when you have several million people that have simply given up on finding a job. And I think it's the reality is that when you look at this data, or when you just look at the evidence on the ground, we have so many people living in informal settlements, so many million people that live in very crowded small areas because they don't have jobs. There aren't economic opportunities. You see people move from rural to urban areas for the hope of a better life, and that they can't find employment. So the reality in South Africa is that most people that want to find a job might not get it. If we think of people that are finishing high school this year, the chances of them getting a job if they go out into the labor market is probably about 1 in 4. I'd say 1 in 4 people finishing high school that want to get a job that might not be going on to university, about 1 in 4 of them will actually get a job. So it's that kind of discouragement, the realization that most people don't get a job that are actually looking for one.
Interesting. So let's look at some of the numbers involved in the jobs reports. The number of employed persons decreased in 3 of the 10 industries, with the largest decrease recorded in finance. That's about 278,000, followed by community and social services around 166,000, manufacturing 83,000. Then we saw increases recorded for construction, 143,000, which should be a good sign for the economy when construction is employing and starting to boom back. And then trade also increased with 108,000 jobs. So what are these numbers in these specific industries telling us about what's happening in South Africa?
So the two that I'd probably want to think of is, you mentioned construction. So that's good news. As part of the country's economic recovery process and plan, there's a focus from government on infrastructure spending. It's been one of our key plans for the past 10 years, to be honest. So the construction jobs, that's good news. The bad news part is that category you mentioned called finance. Now that actually includes finance and a bunch of other services, business services, and it actually has a big component of small service businesses. So you're thinking of people that might be working on their own as an accountant or a lawyer, or in let's call it in the blue collar area, it's electricians or plumbers. We've seen so many of those jobs just disappear since COVID-19 arrived, because firstly of lockdowns, but secondly, as the economy is opening up, because there are so many people with fewer jobs, there are so many companies that have closed down, there's less demand for these service-based small businesses. And that for me is the biggest concern. Globally, small business is where the jobs should come from. That's where the jobs are created. And now we're seeing in these numbers that actually small business remains under significant pressure in South Africa.
And interesting, because even in conversations around the continent and other areas, we're hearing about a push for the local economies. While countries are looking for investors to bring in the FDI, a lot of concentration does have to also be put in the informal sector and also on the local economies, because that's where, as you said, the jobs come from. So this survey, and of course the numbers coming out, also have a gendered aspect, and I need us to quickly take a look at that. So the reports are that South Africa's labor market is more favorable to men than women. Men are more likely to be in paid employment than women, regardless of race, while women are more likely than men to be also doing unpaid work. The proportion of men in employment is higher than that of women, and more men than women are participating in the labor market, as the labor force participation rate of men is higher than that of women. The unemployment rate among men, even though overall the rate is high, it's still lower than it is for women. So what does this tell us about the opportunities for women in South Africa's labor force? Does this require special attention, or do you think this is something that will right itself as the labor force and the economy starts to do better overall?
Well, I mean, the gender disparity is not something that's unique to South Africa.
Yes.
It's something we see across the world. And yes, the numbers are favoring men, to be very honest. It is something that is a high priority for South African companies and for the government as well, where employment equity is very high on the agenda as a way of supporting household income, socioeconomic development, societal stability, all those important elements. It's not something that's going to be fixing itself. It's not something that could get right on its own, even though from a legal perspective, South Africa is actually a very equal society when it comes to the rights of men and women. As we see in many other countries, the reality is that historical, cultural, religious, all kinds of different elements translate into women having a disadvantage compared to men. Like I say, it is an important priority. We can think of, for example, beginning of November, South Africa, we have municipal elections, so it's local city elections, and many of the political parties have come out and again restated their goal of having 50-50 representation in their leaders, in their public officials, in terms of a male-female split. The ruling party is probably close to that at this stage. I think the latest number was about 46% female representation. So there's certainly more work to do. We do have, in the highest levels of government, we have ministers that have specific focus on women and youth and disabilities. So certainly we are seeing efforts, but as, again, with most countries in the world, this takes a long time to address. It It takes a long time before changes actually happen. But at least I want to say on an official level, on a public and a private sector level, there is work being done to right this situation.
All right. So, Christie, hold the line, as I'd like to say. When we come back, we'll look at some other things. There's an interesting trend that the numbers show us, that there seems to be some kind of dissonance between growth in the real GDP and actually South Africa losing jobs. So let's explain that, because many would expect that real GDP growth leads to an increase in jobs, but that's not exactly the situation if we follow the trend. We're looking at South Africa's Q2 jobs report and what it means for the continent's most industrialized economy. The conversation will continue right after this. Still with me is Christie Viljoen. He's an economist at PwC South Africa. Now, Christie, early on in the conversation, you had mentioned that South Africa already had a high unemployment rate before the effects of COVID-19, already at 28% and upwards, calling it a structural, long-standing problem. Now, there are a number of people who like to say that it's the restrictions, it's the lockdown, it's the coronavirus that really jumped those numbers to the numbers that South Africa is seeing now, and also shrank the economy by 7%. But really, how much is COVID-19 and its attendant consequences really to blame for where South Africa stands with its unemployment figure, given, again, as you said, its long-standing structural problems that have just now been compounded by a year of what no one could have imagined?
Well, we can do a simple calculation, I think. You mentioned just more than 7 million unemployed people. We know that in 2020, because of the lockdown, because of COVID-19, South Africa lost a net 1.4 million jobs. So out of that 7 million unemployed, only 1.4 we can really blame on COVID-19. So the rest is, as we've discussed, it's the structural factors. And I think at this stage, the biggest challenge for us is that businesses are telling the government that they need concessions and reforms in the labor market. A government has acknowledged this, and there's a need for it. It is very difficult to, when a worker does not perform, or when you do not need someone in the employment anymore, to get rid of them, to fire them, as one would basically call it. It's very challenging to do that in South Africa. We have a very high labor market rights for the workers. And from historical perspective, labor unions have been very powerful within the sphere of government influence. That is basically the political history in South Africa for the past 20, 30 years, where labor unions who look out for their members, it's basically their job to take care of their members. They make sure that those who are employed are protected. And companies are telling the government that we need to be able to more easily employ people and more easily let them go if they are not performing. So making it easier in that perspective, making it easier for companies to employ someone and know that if they do not perform, they'll have to be let go, and that we can let them go. That's going to go a long way towards allowing businesses to take on more people, because there's always going to be movement in jobs. There's always going to be people coming in and out of jobs, but it is very, very tricky to get someone off your payroll once it is necessary for you to do so. And that's making companies hesitant to create jobs. You would rather not create a job than get someone on board and then not be able to let's say, replace them if they are actually not performing their duties.
And this example that you brought up is actually something we've seen play out in the negotiations around South African Airlines. Also, it's part of the consideration that has happened with unbundling of Eskom and the plan being presented. So we can see the real life sort of consequences and repercussions of this strong protection of the labor force within South Africa. Let's talk about workers now, because part of this, not just the unemployment, is the fact that South African consumers' personal finances also have been deteriorating because of how the economy has been performing and COVID-19 and the unemployment rate. So there are now higher levels of financial vulnerability in Q2 2021 because the COVID-19 social relief grant ended in March 2021. So that extra bit of buffer room that came from the government has been removed for many, many households in South Africa. And there are also increases with rising fuel and food prices, high unemployment, and limited salaries. What do South Africans need the most? Because there have been calls that the government should reinstate, and they have to some point reinstated the social relief grants. But is it about grants? Is it about jobs? Is it about making the investment or the environment more friendly for local businesses to grow? Is it a mix? What do you think?
I think the best answer is there should be a mix. At this stage, we already have a very large social grant system where children in households where the parents are unemployed, children can get grants. There's grants for pensioners, for the disabled. So there's a big social transfer system already in South Africa. For people struggling at the moment, the question is, what do they need most? They need those grants right now. We know that the grant system that was introduced last year with emergency, let's call them emergency grants due to COVID-19, was extended quite a few times, finished again in March, and there was again a new introduction in July following some social unrest in the country that's directly linked to unemployment, inequality, and poverty. So the most immediate need for households would be that cash. The most immediate need for the economy, and that's been the case for 10 years, 15 years, is to stimulate employment growth. You would rather have someone with a sustainable long-term formal job that can take care of themselves than being dependent on government. It comes back to that adage of either giving someone a fish or teaching them to fish. And it's a balance between making sure someone's got something to eat today, but it would be better if they are able to fish for themselves tomorrow. So it's certainly a balance, and the balance is where it gets tricky. At the moment, there is debate within the ruling party and other stakeholders about the introduction of a basic income grant. And it's something that is getting serious attention in the political arena. But obviously, it's the question of who's going to fund this.
Yes.
And there's, again, talk about the middle class, the high-income earners needing to fund this with higher taxes. So a mix and a balance, but a balance for one person is not a balance for the other. So that's where it's going to get still very tricky to determine exactly how we approach this.
Very, very interesting. So you mentioned about stimulating the economy and growth. So let's get into a trend that the numbers are showing us. So South Africa continued to lose jobs in Q1 2021, despite 4 consecutive quarters of real GDP growth, showing that this correlation we sort of assumed between growth and jobs may not be what it seems for South Africa. We've also seen a rebasing of the GDP. Employment data has been checked and rechecked. PwC found that in Q4 of 2019, since that time, there has been a diminishing relationship between real GDP growth and job creation in South Africa. Break this down for us. How can this be explained that we are seeing GDP growth, but South Africa is not seeing the jobs commensurate with what we traditionally expect?
Yes, so there's historically a very close relationship between GDP growth and employment growth. It's very simple. If the economy grows, there's more jobs. So what we saw last year, I mean, if we think of it this way, GDP fell because of COVID-19, first half of the year. Second half, it started coming back. And then GDP is continuing onwards, but employment has been quite flat. So GDP has been growing the first half of 2021, and we've actually lost some jobs. So that relationship appears to be broken. We're not saying it is a permanent break, but the reality is that we are now in basically a jobless recovery. We've spoken about employment. We've spoken about social grants to support this. We've spoken about why we have high unemployment in South Africa. This is compounding all of these challenges. So we're seeing companies are doing well again in terms of revenues, in terms of exports, in terms of all those kinds of activities, but they are not adding those jobs that were lost last year. We've got so many challenges for companies that they don't want to add these jobs, and it's only compounding South Africa's challenges with unemployment and poverty. We saw in certain places in the country social unrest that caused lots of damage, a lot of loss of business and theft that for many reasons happened, but some of the key reasons are the fact that people are not employed, the people that don't have jobs to take care of their families. So all of this is a worrying trend. We're not sure yet why it has been broken. We're not sure how long it's going to be broken. But the fact is that at the moment, it looks like a jobless recovery, and we can certainly not afford that.
So that brings us to my last question. A jobless recovery, something that the most industrialized nation on the continent cannot afford right now. But good signs in construction, good signs in 1 or 2 other industries, but not so good signs elsewhere. Trading is still basically flat. What then needs to be done? If we do agree that this is a long-standing structural problem, if we're just looking at returning 1-point-something million jobs lost during COVID and then trying to expand that to address the longer standing unemployment issues. What needs to be done? It's not just the Cyril Ramaphosa administration. It goes beyond that. Whoever becomes president, whoever sits in parliament, making the necessary decisions on these issues. What does South Africa need to do?
There are many things we could and should do, and there's many of those that we've had to do them many years ago to sort of avoid this situation. But I think, given what we've discussed in this today, we should get back to jobs. It's a question of creating jobs. We need private sector jobs. The government is doing what it can in terms of also creating jobs, and they can only to a certain extent do that because there's pressure on fiscal finances. We need the private sector to create more jobs, so there needs to be an environment where they feel comfortable to do this. And the only way we're going to really see that is if government makes the necessary changes to labor market policies and laws. It's something it's been very hesitant to do that for obvious reasons, with the strong influence by labor unions. And it's sort of a chess game where no one is really winning at this stage because the private sector is afraid of creating the jobs. And then the government then on the other side, they actually want economic growth. They want taxes to increase, but there's certainly no middle ground yet. There's certainly no solution yet. And I'm concerned that there isn't going to be a resolution anytime soon, and that these very ugly unemployment numbers will remain high and cause the country lots of social pressures going forward.
Unfortunately, ending on not such a good note, but I think a note that does require warning action to be taken and a lot of focus, particularly for South Africa. Christie, as always, a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you very much.
All right. And hoping to find some sort of solution to what's happening in South Africa. But what we do agree on is that the work needs to be done. It was this year that South Africa, followed by Namibia and Nigeria, the largest economy on the continent, came in as the top 3 countries with the highest unemployment rates on the continent. How can South Africa return more than 1 million jobs lost because of COVID and also address the long-standing structural unemployment issues in the country? It has to take action. Continue watching us right here on Business Edge as we continue to address these issues, not just in South Africa, but across the continent. Up next is NC4 to watch as we wrap things up. And some stories for you to keep an eye out for as we wrap things up on Business Edge today. We start with startup talk, and Andela, another Nigerian startup, has attained unicorn status after raising $200 million from investors. Now, Andela is involved in connecting African software engineering talent to global companies. Andela joins Flutterwave and Opay as 2 other Nigerian fintech companies that reached unicorn status this year, coming behind InterSwitch. As South African Stock Exchange reopens, it is pledging to lure firms from across the continent with listing costs that are a third of those charged by the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. While a wave of initial public offerings sweep across the world, firms on the continent and in the continent's most industrialized nation, especially smaller companies, have been delisting from South Africa's main exchange in recent years due to cost and complicated compliance issues. The Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa Federation of Women in Business and the African E-Trade Group have launched an online platform for traders in the regional bloc. The platform, dubbed Sukoku, will enable traders to conduct cross-border trade using information technology, which minimizes physical barriers. The platform enables manufacturers and suppliers in different states to share information on their potential to produce and supply products. And finally, Zimbabwe has increased its carbon emissions reduction target to 40% from the initial 33% by including more industries. Now it is not just energy, but waste, industrial processes, and agricultural industries that are being targeted. The country seeks to limit carbon dioxide emissions to 44.7 million tons by 2030. If no action is taken, emissions could climb to 75.4 million tons by 2030. According to research, Zimbabwe emitted 35.8 million tons in 2017. And that's it right here on Business Edge. That's what we have for you today. Don't forget to follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. You can also subscribe on our YouTube channel if you've missed any of our conversations. Download our mobile app and, of course, make it a date Monday through Friday, West African time, as we talk the biggest business stories, financial and economic, from here on the continent. That is, except for tomorrow. Tomorrow is October the 1st, and we'll be using parts of Business Edge to delve into issues surrounding Nigeria's 61 years of independence. So join us from 7 a.m. right here on News Central. I'm Tolulokwe Adeleru Balogun.